Good evening. Is this on, Hank? All right. Good evening. I want to thank you all for coming to this energy and clean tech series on distributed energy generation, fantasy or future. I'm Phil Retker. I'm the event coordinator for this evening. I'm just going to very briefly describe the energy and clean tech series for those of you who may not have been here before, and then hand it off to our panel. I think we've got an exciting evening ahead of us. The Energy and Clean Tech series runs about once a month. We have about 3 different kinds of events. One is Mighty on the Road, MIT Energy Initiative on the Road, which Doug has organized, bringing professors from the Institute out here to speak about some of their research and some of the innovations going on at the Institute. It's a way to bring the activities of the Institute closer to all of us here in the alumni group. The other kind of events we run are panel discussions, just such as you'll see here, and also individual guest speakers. And we've got a few of those coming up. Doug will talk about them later tonight. Some of the topics that we've covered have been innovations in materials, solar, storage systems. We've got one coming up on the future of the grid. We've had a presentation on the future and the opportunities in nuclear, really trying to cover the whole gamut of energy and clean tech areas. Tonight, one of the things that we're doing, you'll notice that there are 3x5 cards on all the tables, and I think there are some in the back as well. What we'd like to do is, as the panel goes through their topics and their discussions, if you have any questions, please write them down. And a little after 8 o'clock or so, we'll open this up for discussion or for questions from the audience. And we'll have a number of volunteers that'll be around. If you've got a card with a question on it, just flag it in the air. Somebody will pick it up. We'll bring them together and get them to Eric. So now I'd like to introduce Eric Wesoff. He's the editor-in-chief of Green Tech Media, and he is our moderator for tonight. He'll introduce the panelists.
So thank you. So thanks to the MIT Club of Northern California, to Morrison Foster, who's a sponsor, and to the people who made the venue possible, Silicon Valley Bank. Thank you. My name is Eric Wesoff. I'm the editor-in-chief of Green Tech Media. Show of hands, does anybody know who Green Tech Media is? Good answer, excellent answer. We just celebrated our 5th anniversary, and I myself have written 1,400 articles in the green tech space. And that sounds tedious when you say it like that, but it actually means I've met 1,400 CEOs, and I've visited 1,400 companies, and I've looked at 1,400 technologies, and it's an absolutely incredibly gratifying and great job for someone. If you have to develop a thick skin, because I'm called an idiot numerous times a day. We're being videoed for archive, so if you want to turn your phones off, that would be great. Also, keep the nudity and profanity to a minimum. And I know this is a very staid, reserved, reticent crowd, and so I want to change that level of decorum. So hang on. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. I'll be here all week, and please tip your server. That's right. Okay. So in a narrow sense, I have about 4 minutes to talk. In a narrow sense, you know, it's an easy summary of what we want to talk about tonight. Governor Brown's 33% renewable electricity portfolio calls for 12,000 megawatts of renewable generation at customer sites by 2020. You know, distributed generation avoids some of the capacity and transmission issues from large utility scale energy projects, but the electrical system is not built to handle that type of architecture. That's and it's not designed both from a technical as well as perhaps a regulatory standpoint to handle that type of change. But that's the narrow way of looking at what we want to talk tonight. I think from a broader standpoint is we need to just stop and back off for a second and see if this is just more than just about photovoltaics on rooftops. I would suggest that it's about changing the fundamental model and role of the utility in our life. And instead of having this top-down statist command control type of model, instead the utility becomes a different type of animal. It becomes a partner with the consumer. It becomes a distribution network or a hub or a customer for aggregators. And it becomes an absolutely different animal than what we are used to, what a utility looks like today. And it could possibly become, instead of, it's so easy to beat up on utilities. Sorry, pg&e, gentlemen. It's the easiest thing to do. But instead of an antagonistic relationship, the utility can become an ally and an enabler of innovation and entrepreneurship instead of a squelcher. I don't know if that's a word, squelcher. Instead of an agent of squelcher. So 1 minute on one other thing I want to talk about that's slightly related, and this is absolutely about self-promotion. And it's nothing to do with green tech media, so I don't have my journalist hat on now, but I'm working with a team of people, believe it or not, who are going to be buying HECO, which is the Hawaiian electric utility. And personally, I'm $3.499999 billion short of actually making that purchase price. But we actually have a team of native Hawaiians and haoles who are intent on tendering an offer for the Hawaiian electric utility. Most of you probably know, but where does Hawaii get its electrical power? Burns oil. It burns oil. Tankers come from all over the world, and they burn oil and they burn coal to produce 80% of their power. But Hawaii's exists on a series of volcanoes. What kind of power do you think you could get from that? You think you'd get geothermal from that, and yet Hawaii only has 30 megawatts of geothermal power. I don't want to dwell on this too much, but what we are talking about is changing the incumbent inertia that a 2.5 gigawatt capacity utility like HECO has in Hawaii to becoming a green paradise. Why doesn't that island run on geothermal? Why doesn't it run on solar and wind and tidal power? Again, it's about changing the role of the utility in our lives. And so if you want to talk about that HECO thing, I'll be around. I'm more than glad to chat about it if you have. We are actually, 6 months ago it was sort of, I was just on it for the ride, but it actually has transformed into very close to a reality, and we're talking with major financial entities who are very, very interested in making this happen. So you'll see us on Time Magazine in 12 to 18 months. If you can't make renewable energy work on Hawaii, we're doomed. 35 to 45 cents per kilowatt hour is what the citizens pay. And right now the PUC, HECO is going to the PUC saying, we've put all this solar out and we've reduced the amount of electricity we sell. Can you give us higher rates? So there's this horrible spiral as they have more DG, they end up with higher rates, and that's something we're going to probably address tonight. Okay, that's the self-promotion part of it. We have a panel that spans the power sector from regulatory to legal to advocacy to research to the bad people at the utility itself. And between the four of them, they have 280 man and woman years of experience. I'm sorry, that was just uncalled for. But they have an enormous body of knowledge and experience, and hopefully we can hear from them, and they'll share that with us. I was asked to ask the audience a few questions. So, question one. How many people have solar on their roofs? All right. That isn't. You can lie as well, but it's a rather enlightened crowd. That's more hands than I typically see. And the other question I wanted to ask was, when I hear DG, when I hear distributed generation, the easy answers, the low-hanging fruit, those I'll go after, are solar, and PV, and fuel cells. Okay? Pipe in with some other types of distributed generation that you think falls into that category, stuff we'll be addressing. Again, I came up with the easy answers. The hard answers are for you. Does anybody have a shot on what else DG is? Treadmills. Okay, absolutely. Wind, geothermal, gas turbines, microhydro, like hydrovolts or something like that, right? Excuse me? Waste gas? Micronuclear, okay. Excuse me? And cogen. So those are great answers, and it evidences a knowledgeable crowd. 280 man years. I think I covered that part. Harmonica, I covered harmonica. And so that covers my introduction. What we're going to do is we're going to have each of the four panelists speak for about 5 or 6 minutes, or as long as they can be interesting. Diane's going first. She doesn't have slides. The other panelists do. Diane, do you want to come up here and talk?
Sure.
And so tell us about yourself.
How about how to pronounce my name? Should I start with
That would be fine, or spelling it, which they misspelled on it.
Right. No.
And also, I mean, you have some prepared remarks, but...
No, they aren't prepared.
Okay.
I just prepared them right
Okay,
now.
So tell us about yourself, and as well as your take on DG.
Okay. I'm Dian Grueneich, and there won't be a quiz on spelling my name, and I won't be playing the harmonica. Otherwise, anything can go. I have been involved in energy in California for almost 35 years. I started off in the first Jerry Brown administration working for the California Energy Commission, which does a big report every couple of years on energy policy, sites, power plants, et cetera. And so I was actually involved 3 decades ago when the state was last interested in renewable energy, and sort of lots of the activity that went around that. I did various things, all in the energy space, and then for 6 years between 2005 and 2010, I was a commissioner with the California Public Utilities Commission. And that is the state agency located in San Francisco that regulates and oversees the investor-owned utilities. So David, PG&E, but I want to point out for David, he is the only one on our panel who is an MIT grad. And so since this is MIT night, I think we want to be kind to David for helping on this. No. So I was on the PUC. They regulate the state's utilities, but they also, very importantly, are actually the entity that implements the vast effort going on in California on clean energy. And I was very actively involved in renewables. I served as the commissioner representative on the climate action team that really put in place the whole AB 32 structure. I was very involved in all of the Western energy issues because we have a very interconnected grid, and you need to think about not just sort of the microgrids, but what's happening in the larger sector. I was the lead commissioner on energy efficiency, my last year on demand response, and then I also was the lead commissioner on transmission. And if you think DG's hard, try transmission. Let me just say that. But I am now practicing law with Morrison & Foerster, and so here's my commercial plug. They are one of the co-sponsors tonight, and we thank you for coming. I'm going to just say a couple of things. One is, in case you don't know, California has a loading order, which is actually a very, I think, smart thing to do, and it's in place in statute, and it's been around for about 5 or 6 years. And it says the first thing we do is energy efficiency. You may hear, the best thing to do is to save energy, not use it. So unless you think it's a good answer, I'd actually ask for all of you who raised your hand about you have your PV or your solar, did you also put in insulation? Energy, thank you. Energy efficiency is really boring compared to, you have your solar panels. But actually just putting insulation in your home is the smartest thing you can do to save money and to save the planet and to have jobs. So that's my plug on energy efficiency. And actually it's very important. The state has done a very good job of integrating as it's moving towards renewables to think about the energy efficiency. You can't get a subsidy, part of the rebate, for putting on those PVs unless you actually have an audit that tells you what you can save from doing energy efficiency. So I hope to God you all got that audit, but that's the way it's supposed to work. So we have the first thing is energy efficiency and something called demand response, which is basically saving energy during the times that we have the peak demand. And then we have renewables, and then after that we have clean fossil-fired fuel. I'm going to make just a couple of other points. So what I wanted to say was in the context of thinking about DG, it's actually for California in a larger context. When I was a commissioner, one of the things that we did was we adopted for California, it's called the Long-Term Strategic Plan on Energy Efficiency, because California has the largest energy efficiency program, the most successful program in the entire world. And what we wanted to do was to have a whole roadmap of energy efficiency. The state, in the context of that, actually has adopted as goals what's called zero net energy, that all of our homes by 2020 will be zero net energy new homes, though there's a massive effort on existing homes, and new commercial buildings by 2030 will be zero net energy. What does this mean? It means that as we have our building standards, we're increasingly making them more stringent to bring in the technologies to save energy. But this is why it's important for tonight, because it's a whole vision that says you'll certainly make those buildings more efficient, but they still will need some energy. And where is that energy coming from? And the vision of zero net energy is that you will then have some source of renewable power either on the building or nearby in some community setting. So the policy drivers are not just what you hear about what's going on with feed-in tariffs and sort of all the other aspect of distributed generation, but actually what we're looking at in the efficiency side. And so that's where I'm then going to go to what does the utility look like in the future? And there's tons and tons of conferences and talks about the utility of the future. And I'm sure when we get to EPRI, they've done some really interesting work in that area. But the way the utilities make money, you have public utilities like Silicon Valley Power and Sacramento Municipal Utility District and LADWP who are not for profit. But in California, 80% of the power is supplied by investor-owned utilities, private companies who do have shareholders and who have to turn around a profit. Traditionally, for a utility, the way that they make money is they build power plants, they build transmission lines, they build distribution. It then goes into something called a rate base. Commissioners on commissions, every state has a commission that I served on, looks at those costs, approves them, and when they go in rate base, the utilities can make a profit. That profit goes to the shareholders, and there you have it. And in the context of that, utilities are selling power and making money. Let's switch 10 years out, 15 years out, 5 years out. In a world that is truly zero net energy buildings, that is massive amount of distributed generation, a utility is not necessarily selling very much power. A utility is not necessarily owning very much of the power generation side. And this is actually the very large quandary that in the bigger world of energy people are grappling with, which is we have a whole setup. It's in laws everywhere around the country, frankly a lot in the world, that has this whole way that the utilities make money. And if you talk about a radically different structure, the utility role, quite frankly, shrinks. I don't think there's any way around it. And is that going to be something that happens in a very disruptive manner? Is it going to be something that happens gradually? Will the utilities go into other lines of business? But that's a lot of what we're starting to see play out in a lot of the fights that are going on now. And then I wanted to make one other mention, which is in California in particular, we actually have permitted, financed, and they're under construction 3 major new transmission lines specifically being built for renewable power. The Tehachapi project, the Sunrise project, and the Devers-Blythe transmission line. All of those are being built. There's major amounts of renewables that are starting to come online for that. That is another factor, in addition to what I talked about with the utility model, that's in great deal of tension as we're looking at the role of distributed generation. Because if you fill up those lines completely with renewables, the amount of power that you need for distributed generation to meet the state's 33% is a great deal less. If you don't fill up those lines with renewables, then you suddenly say, well, they may be, in fact, having fossil-fired power that's over those lines. Now, a lot of the discussion is we'll just have more renewables. You know, there is a solution here. And that is the direction the state may be going. But again, this is a lot of the tension that's going on. So I think I'll end with that, of just sort of laying out a few items to be thinking about.
Stay up here for a second. Diane's used to giving keynotes, so keeping her to 6 to 8 minutes is a challenge.
That's my 16 minutes, right?
So so again, when we're talking about DG, it does start to bring in the new role of utilities in this brave future. Another thing is, which we didn't talk about, you could almost consider energy efficiency as a type of distributed generation if you squint.
It's on the minus side,
Sure,
but it's in the
sure.
distributed level.
And now I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot. We were at an event last week. Can you tell me, as somebody from the PUC who served there for a significant time, what's your thought about the general health and condition of California's energy reality?
Only if you buy me a beer after this event.
So that's a no comment?
Yeah.
No comment?
We are undertaking a complex experiment in California. There is no place, well, China actually is also, but it's got command and control. And as a former regulator, I'm jealous of their command and control. I'm going to say it point blank.
Being a dictator would be much better.
It's a lot easier. Our regulatory system in California is not integrated. We have different entities that are in charge of different things. We have a lot of different utilities. As I said, we have investor, we have municipal, and we have a host of different laws and programs that are sort of pulling in one direction on efficiency, pulling in another direction on renewables, large size, in-state, out-of-state, distributed generation. We have smart grid coming in. We have electric vehicles coming in. We have battery storage. It is an experiment in progress. We're going to hear, I assume, at some point tonight about actually we have to keep the grid running. We have to have reliability. I will say, because I have faced down many an angry consumer, we have to think about rates. The new bill that was passed this year on our 33% requires for the first time this commission to actually put in place some major cost containment requirements that's going to have a pressure on DG. So I'm very hopeful. I think this is, I believe strongly in DG. I want it to happen. But a lot of the issues we're going to be facing, this level of renewables, keeping the grid going, how are we going to bring in the EVs, what are we going to do? Nobody yet has tried that on the scale California is trying it. But we can do it. We always do it. How's that?
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, I'm a Mac, so things may not work out really well here. That's good. That's good. So next up is Craig Lewis from the Clean Coalition. All right, and he has 300 slides.
One for each year that I am old, I guess. So I'm going to be talking about distributed generation plus intelligent grid, which in the Clean Coalition's view of the world is the future. It is the future. And there's going to be a lot of changes in the industry that we're all involved in here. And that's just life. You know, the utility industry has been the same for the last 100 years, and it's about time that it changes. I came into the energy industry myself from the telecommunications industry. And if you look at telecommunications 30 years ago, and I know that a lot of you aren't old enough to think back 30 years ago, you weren't even here 30 years ago, but I was, and you had to rent your home telephone from the monopoly telephone company. That was AT&T, nationwide, right? They served the nation, and you had to rent your home telephone from AT&T. Fast forward 30 years, a lot of people don't even have a home telephone. You've got Google Talk, Skype, multiple cell carriers. If you're under probably 20 years old, your most common form of communication is probably Facebook. So we are in an entirely different world now, and that was all driven by policy innovation. The policy innovation drove the technology innovation that led to lots of consumer choice, reduced costs, and a whole brand new world. And guess what? AT&T is still here, and they're thriving, and the utilities will do the same thing. And I know that PG&E is run by really good people like David, and they will figure out a way to thrive in the new utility world too. So the way I came to the Clean Coalition is I did energy policy development for Steve Wesley's gubernatorial campaign back in the 2006 election cycle here in California. We looked at the best practices from around the world, and we said, okay, here's the things that California needs to do to lead into the future in the new energy economy. We need to make sure California gets those technologies here and make sure that California reaps the economic benefits. That was my transition from the telecommunications world into the energy world, and unfortunately, Steve Wesley lost in June of 2006 in the primary, and I had to go to Plan B. And Plan B was to actually become a renewable energy project developer. And I was successful in that venture, have the very first solar project to navigate successfully through California's renewables portfolio standard solicitation process. It was a 2 megawatt sized distributed generation power purchase agreement with PG&E. And then I've been involved in a couple of dozen additional renewable energy projects since then. The only thing that was consistent between all of those projects is that they were all like putting a man on the moon. Really, really difficult. And if California had any chance of achieving its renewable energy objectives, things had to really change. We had to change the way we procure energy, we have to change the way we interconnect energy, and we have to change the way we finance it. Now, good thing is if we change the way we procure it and interconnect it, the financing comes for free. There is no shortage of money getting ready to get into this game and to finance these projects if we fix procurement and interconnection. So what? Yeah, I am doing slides. So this is just a quick view. What the Clean Coalition is really all about is unleashing clean energy. And to do that in a cost-effective fashion, to do it in a timely fashion, and to do it in an environmentally sustainable fashion. And the only way to achieve all those things is to do it in a distributed fashion. So at the end of the day, the Clean Coalition is really about clean local energy. And we've got a lot of people who care about what the Clean Coalition is doing. We've got a former governor on our board of advisors, a former director of the CIA. We've got multiple leaders from the California energy business, including Governor Schwarzenegger's key energy and environmental advisor, 2 former California energy commissioners. We've got a lot of people who know about policy, know about energy, and we're very fortunate to have their assistance. This slide is one of my favorites, and I'm sorry the panelists probably can't see it, but it's basically the Clean Coalition's view of the future. This is the future of the electric grid, and it is all about distributed generation and intelligent grid. And what we define as intelligent grid is demand response, energy storage, electric vehicles, and monitoring, communications, and control. We took a play off of Einstein's formula for energy, and we call monitoring, communications, and control MC squared. And that is the glue that combines the distributed generation with the intelligent grid solutions to make sure that we can do local balancing of supply and demand of energy, and ultimately get to microgrid solutions. And essentially what is shown on this slide, all of it is distributed generation and intelligent grid, except for the picture of the transmission tower. That's it. You take that out and you've got the intelligent grid. So there's a lot of talk here about distributed generation. I think both Eric and Diane, they kind of default into distributed generation as behind the meter. The Clean Coalition actually thinks about distributed generation on the utility side of the meter. This solves a lot of those death spiral issues that the utilities worry about, that everybody net meters down to a $0 bill, and nobody's left paying for the transmission distribution costs that are real. The utilities need to recover those costs. So we say, let's just make it real simple. Let's take best practices from around the world. And guess what? When you look around the world, best practices, the markets that are actually deploying a lot of renewable energy, they just interconnect on the utility side of the meter. It's real simple, and there is no magic to it. The difference between retail DG, which is net metering, and wholesale DG is 2 feet. It just depends on what side of the meter you interconnect to. And if you interconnect to the utility side, the relationship of the customer stays exactly the same with the utility, regardless of whether they have solar panels up on their roof or not. So the United States has really been stuck in these two paradigms. They've been stuck in the retail DG paradigm, which is net metering, and they've been stuck in the central station power paradigm, which is where you're interconnected to transmission, you're long hauling it to where you actually need the energy, where the loads are. But the sweet spot for renewable energy is right in the middle. It's wholesale distributed generation. And that's the circle in the middle here. Now, I said it's got to be cost effective. We were asked by the governor's office to do a study to show them how wholesale DG compares to central station solar. So wholesale DG solar versus central station solar. What you can see on this chart is that once you take transmission costs into account, the most cost-effective solar energy for Californians is wholesale distributed generation. I don't have time to get into the details, but these slides will be available to everybody. Now, does wholesale DG work? Absolutely. I told you that there's lots of places around the world that are actually leading on renewables, and it's not California. This is a comparison of what's happening in Germany compared to California. Just so there's no confusion, Germany is in green. They did 30 times, almost 30 times more solar than California did in 2011. And they did the same thing in 2010. The amount, and by the way, I don't know who made the comment about they spent a lot more.
It's the guys coming up.
Yeah, the Germans have the lowest cost solar in the world. And the people who say that the Germans are paying too much for their solar, they don't understand how the math works. Because the Germans don't have tax benefits like we have here in the United States. The Germans don't have the solar resource quality that we have here in California, or anywhere else in the United States for that matter. They have the solar resource quality of Alaska. So when you normalize for tax benefits and solar resource quality, the Germans are paying about 10 cents a kilowatt hour. California has not even dreamed of doing solar at 10 cents a kilowatt hour today. We're not even close to that today. The Germans are doing it today. So the Germans are cranking, and that's despite the fact, like I said, that they have a solar resource quality that is the equivalent of Alaska. And guess what? Almost all of the German solar is going up on rooftops. It is distributed generation. It's wholesale. It's interconnecting directly to the utility side of the meter. It is not serving on-site load. So the Germans are the perfect example of wholesale distributed generation. 7.5 gigawatts in 7.4 gigawatts in 2010, 7.5 gigawatts in 2011. If California had done an equivalent amount of solar, that would be 4% of its total load each of those years. We would have done almost 10% of California's energy today would be coming from solar from just 2 years of deployments. Okay, that's it for me.
Okay, hang on, stay there. So, in case I don't know if we have an anti-DG person on the panel. We certainly have a pro-DG person on the panel. Just in terms of numbers, Germany put up 7.5 gigawatts this year. The entire United States put up 1.7 gigawatts. I have to ask you, I'm a reporter at in the 80 hours a week that I work that job.
You crank out about 3,000 articles in that time?
Who is funding your organization?
So the Clean Coalition is funded primarily from foundations. So we have foundations like the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which is obviously a foundation that made its money in oil, and they've decided that they need to help move the world off of oil. So we're very proud to have support from Rockefeller Brothers Fund. We've got about 5 foundations that take the majority of our funding.
Okay. And when you're talking about WDG, wholesale DG, are you talking about, I didn't read your slides, you sent them to me, I didn't read them. Are you talking about 2 to 20 megawatts? Is that the sweet spot that seems the right, or is it 1 kilowatt to 20 megawatts?
Yeah, so the Clean Coalition is, when we talk about distributed generation, we talk about being interconnected to the distribution grid for serving local load. And the largest project size you're going to be able to get onto the distribution grid is about 20 megawatts. And not every distribution grid can support that. So some distribution circuits, you're going to be limited to a couple of megawatts, and others you can actually get up to 20 megawatts. But our definition of DG is interconnected to the distribution grid, serving local load. You're not interconnected to the distribution grid and then getting put up on the transmission grid to be ported over and then down converted to some other distribution grid, right? It's interconnected to the distribution grid for local load. And it's from 20 megawatts down to 0, right? If you're on a residential rooftop like solar projects are in Germany, you're interconnected to the utility side of the meter, so that could be a 5 kilowatt size project.
Okay, thank you,
Yeah.
thank you. I saw Craig 2 nights ago at the Palo Alto City Council meeting. I've never lived until you've sat through a number of Palo Alto City Council meetings. But the good news is that Palo Alto, if things go right, on March 5th will be voting for a feed-in tariff for Palo Alto of 4 megawatts at 14 cents per kilowatt hour, right? And so March 5th, you can read about it in Green Tech Media. And that's large commercial only, right? That's the way they're starting out that program.
It's medium commercial, 50 kilowatts to 1 megawatt size projects.
Okay. Next is Bryan Hannegan from EPRI, and he has 1 slide. But you can talk for your...
Sort of a rarity for EPRI.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, thank you. In fact, please, let's just applaud that.
You know, I'm actually gonna pull the slide down for a moment because I do want to say a few words about myself and also about EPRI. So I have a confession to make, and it really pains me to do this, but I applied to MIT as an undergraduate. I was accepted, and I turned you guys down. Now, I realized the error of my ways, and I applied for graduate school, and you guys said no. So it just goes to show you, if you get the chance to go to MIT, take it, right? As Eric mentioned, my name's Bryan Hannegan. This is now my 2nd panel with Eric, and the harmonica has made 2 appearances. So if you see Eric and you like harmonica, they tend to go together. I'm the vice...
Accordion, it could be worse.
Yeah, and the ukulele, evidently, given your HECO investment. I'm at EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute. It's a nonprofit, independent research organization based in Palo Alto. We've been around since 1973. We're funded in a mixture of support from utilities, both investor-owned, public, rural electric co-ops, but also a variety of foundation grants, federal and state funding, and we do a number of technology-related projects across the various areas related to the production, the delivery, and the use of electric power. I manage EPRI's Environment and Renewable Energy Research divisions, and I've been doing that since about 2007. Before that, I was one of those bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., working on energy and environment policy for both the U.S. Senate and the White House. So I have some familiarity with the regulatory and the legislative context, but I'm not going to talk about that. Hopefully we can get into that on the questions. I do want to say, though, that I was impressed by Craig's slide because it included many of the same things that I wanted to show you on this. The primary difference, though, is that in our power system of the future, or in our smarter grid outline, you can see down at the bottom there's a variety of issues beyond just the distributed generation aspects that we think are going to be critical challenges for the power sector as it goes forward. The last time I was with Eric, I made this statement, and I stand by it, that I think that not only in California but around the world, this next decade is probably the biggest decade of transformation that the electric power industry has ever seen or will see. And part of that will be aided and abetted by technology, but part of that will also be aided and abetted by regulation, by legislation, by financing. And I think we're in the midst of the beginnings of that change. Most of what's on the right-hand side of this diagram are the very same things that Craig showed in his. You see the distributed solar there on the rooftops. You see the energy storage at the neighborhood or at the substation level. You see electric vehicles charging but also generating electricity. I'd add, given Diane's focus on energy efficiency, you're going to see consumers that are much more dynamic, responding to price signals either through automated technologies in the home or by outright demand response themselves. That's going to add some variability to the grid in ways at the end of the pipe, so to speak, that we haven't seen for a while. You've got customers in industrial and commercial applications taking hold of their energy bills and managing them, not just with distributed generation, but also this whole building envelope approach of the kind that economically they'll do in the near future, and they'll be required to do so as building standards increase going on down the road. The red arrows on this slide represent, I think, a paradigm shift for the way in which we look at the power system. It used to be that we treated the transmission and the distribution assets as sort of a one-way delivery stream to a relatively passive consumer on the far end. And upstream, if you will, on the left-hand side of this diagram, you had a lot of large generation assets that were utility scale, fossil, nuclear, and yes, renewables of various types. I argue, and this is a position that is not well shared within the industry, but I would argue that by the time this smart grid, such as it is, gets implemented, we're going to have a much more dynamic, yes, distributed, and yes, decentralized power system of the future that's got a lot of challenges associated with it. You're not simply going to be able to run it on distributed generation alone. You will need some utility scale generation. And the challenge there, as we've seen, is when you bring distributed PV into distribution feeders at high penetration, you put those distribution transformers, the lines themselves, the switches, the substations, through a tremendous amount of variability that we're monitoring at very high resolution on a number of circuits where we see 30, 40, 80% PV penetration. And we've got some really neat animations. I wish I had brought one. But to counteract that, you've got to think creatively about how do I create inverters that give me voltage support when I need it, that give me power when I need it, that give me all sorts of other benefits to help smooth out and buffer to the rest of the system what's going on with variability. And the same can be true for large or small scale wind. The same can be true for large or small scale solar. I actually think distributed generation has a bigger role to play if it is coupled with something else. And I'm getting some head nods over here. It's either energy storage, it's either other resources, or it's demand side management. And the markets and the consumers will ultimately decide which ones are the most cost effective for their areas. I also, since I'm in the renewable energy space, one of my largest concerns is as we build out in this state and others to 20, 30, 50%, and ultimately higher penetrations of renewables, wind, solar, biomass, hydro, they're all dependent on the environment. And what I didn't tell you about MIT is that I applied to go there as a meteorologist. And we support a lot of the work of your Global Change program in a variety of areas. And a lot of the work that we're engaged in with you guys right now is to look at the inherent variability of the resources that the renewables have to draw from and what challenges that creates for the reliability of the grid going forward. When I was part of something called a California's Energy Future Study that the California Council on Science and Technology put out, when we focused on renewables, we were concerned mostly about what we called the gigawatt day problem. When you have a high pressure system come in and sit over a gigawatt of wind turbine capacity, or when you have a protracted cloudy period that diminishes solar, you need a lot of other resources, be they demand, be they storage, be they generation, to bring onto the system. And how do you do that and maintain the environmental constraints and the financial constraints that are required to keep the system operable? So I'll contest with this chart that you've got a lot of different challenges coming at you in terms of the power system of the future. You've got many more points of access for both generation of technology, generation of renewables and other forms of electricity, but also the consumption of it. And this question of reliability, of keeping the grid reliable and matching supply and demand at all times and all days, as much as we want to focus on the cost and as much as we want to focus on the environmental virtues, somebody's got to watch out for the reliability as well. And my view is it's going to take a full portfolio of technologies to make sure that we achieve all three of those goals: affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy for our state, for our country, and for the world. So I'll stop with that, Eric. I look forward to everybody's questions. And yeah, sorry about the admissions thing.
Hang on one second. So EPRI is a 501c3,
Yes.
but you, to a great extent, are funded by the utilities, right? And your budget is $400 million a year or
Thereabouts,
something
yeah.
like that. This is rather salty language for a representative of the utilities. Is this really the way EPRI thinks? Is this the institutional culture that within EPRI that seems to be somewhat forward-looking and not drill, baby, drill?
If you look at all of those topics down at the bottom, those are the key strategic issues around which we organize our research portfolio. And in fact, of the $375 million or so that we're spending, about $120 million of that, so a full 1/3 of it, is on the right-hand side of the diagram, which is dramatically increased from even just a few years ago. And I'd argue that some of our work on the demand side with power delivery and utilization, with integration of renewables, there are a lot of folks that are out there working on the technologies. There's not as many thinking about how we work them into the system and sort of fix the airplane as it's flying, which is really at the heart of the challenge that I think Diane mentioned in her talk. So while there's a need to keep the existing system running, and yes, be more efficient with fossil fuel and come up with new, perhaps nuclear technologies that make sense, you've also got to do all this other stuff. And if you look, the great majority of what we've got here is really non-traditional. The final point that I'll make is when we show this, and it's my CEO, it's my bosses, it's their bosses, it's our board of directors, we don't get any pushback from this chart at all. What we do get the pushback from is how are we as utilities, as power companies, going to continue to provide a service to our customers that they will pay us for? And so to the point of, how do we transition the business model, I think that may even be a bigger challenge than the technology. If you ask any utility CEO worth their salt, if they could make as much money selling solar as they do selling coal, I think they'd do it.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So what Bryan said is this is the potentially most transformative decade for utilities since their history of utilities, and that also provides for opportunities as well for entrepreneurs. I live up on Skyline Boulevard in Skylanda, and every winter we have trees down and wires down, and the pg&e is my hero. Okay, because no matter how crappy the weather is, there's guys up there fixing it fast. So I want to try to make up, the nasty things I said. I know you're not the guy in the hard hat, but they are truly my heroes. Those guys are up there fast, and they really KTLO. They keep the lights on. So, thank you. So David Ruben from pg&e will now defend himself. Thanks.
Just push this down. This one.
Down. Must
You're
be
a
must be
Mac guy.
You must be
No,
a
I'm
Mac.
actually a PC guy. I think I need a hug. Okay, so I've come to expect this from Eric and from Craig and others for that matter, but in any event, thank you, by the way, for the call out on the guys and gals in the hard hats that do work hard to keep the lights on, because that's a very important function of what we do at PG&E. My background, I did go to MIT. Do you need more, or is that enough? Many, many, many decades ago. Anyway, let me go ahead and talk very quickly so that we can move on to the more interesting part of the panel, which is the Q&A. We're in Silicon Valley Power land. PG&E serves much of northern and central California, but there are a number of governmental-owned utilities in the area, and we're, again, in one of them now. I'm assuming, though, that many of you are our customer. Show of hands. So most of you that are our customers did install solar. I'm glad to hear that. Thank you. Anyway, so again, we serve much of northern and central California. We probably the most interesting thing about this particular slide, just beyond the self-introduction, is that we serve about 5% of the U.S. population and emit about 1% of the greenhouse gases associated with electric supply in the U.S. We have a very clean power portfolio, and it's continuing to get cleaner. When I say clean, meaning greenhouse gases primarily, and it's made up of large hydro as well as nuclear, and then a growing part of our portfolio is in the form of what are called qualifying renewable resources. You heard Diane and others speak about the 33% renewable portfolio requirement that we have by 2020, and we are working very hard and aggressively to continue to add new supplies that fall within the general definition of qualifying renewables, which include hydro less than 30 megawatts, biomass, geothermal, wind, solar, wave, etc. What I did want to spend my plus or minus 5 minutes talking about, though, are the various programs that we have to help either customers put renewable systems on their side of the meter, if that's what they choose to do, and or work with developers in order to have them provide us with renewable supplies, again, to continue to provide our customers with cleaner and cleaner energy. So starting at the top of the slide and working our way down, and you can see running along the x-axis is sort of a rough sense of size of the projects that fall under these programs. The first one at the top is the California Solar Initiative, which is part of a statewide program to help customers, again, that want to install clean energy systems, specifically solar, on their roofs. To do so, we provide essentially an upfront buy-down amount for those types of systems, projects up to 1 megawatt in size. We also have a self-generation incentive program, which actually used to include solar many years ago until solar was separated out. And this provides financial incentives for other types of clean on-site generating systems, wind, fuel cells, combined heat and power, et cetera, again, for projects up to 1 megawatt. Net energy metering is essentially a companion program to other types of on-site renewables. So when customers produce more than they consume in real time, they're allowed to effectively spin the meter backwards in order to get a financial credit on their bill, and it helps improve the economics of on-site generation. We also have a program called Renewable Energy System Bill Credit Transfer. It's RESBCT. Sounds like something Aretha Franklin would have dreamt up. But it allows governmental agencies that want to, for example, put a solar unit at the corporation yard where there may not be much load, and get a bill credit, say at City Hall or a fire station or something along those lines. The bill credit's equal to the generation part of the rate, which is a portion of the total rate. Then we have feed-in tariff programs, which today are available for projects up to 1.5 megawatts. And again, I don't know if you're familiar with the terms that I'm using with respect to project size, but these are, in the scheme of things, somewhat smaller types of projects. The feed-in tariff is similar in form to what Craig had referred to earlier. The dollar amounts that we pay, by the way, are quite a bit less than, for example, they pay in Germany or paid in Spain or many of the European countries. But we have had a lot of success with this program. We now have a wait list, and we're working through a process at the Public Utilities Commission to expand the upper size threshold of the program to 3 megawatts and also revise the pricing. So we're looking forward to that program being reinvigorated at some point soon. And then working our way further down the list, we have something called a renewable auction mechanism that was approved last year. For PG&E, this represents about 420 megawatts total of projects in the sweet zone, as Craig had referred to it, the 1 to 20 megawatt size project range. It's similar in some sense to a program that we had submitted to the Public Utilities Commission a bit earlier and gotten approval for, which is a little further down the slide, called the PV RFO. RFO is request for offers, where we are going to the market in order to get a total of 250 megawatts over 5 years, 50 megawatts a year, again from PV projects in the 1 to 20 megawatt size range, and then also develop a similar amount, 250 megawatts over 5 years, of projects that PG&E would own. And we had proposed this several years ago, and again, consistent with Craig's comments, it was acknowledged at the time that we had a number of projects that were much larger than 20 megawatts, and then a lot of rooftop systems, less than a megawatt, but there was this kind of gap in the middle. And so the programs that I mentioned, the renewable auction mechanism and PG&E's PV RFO and our utility-owned generation for PV really fit neatly within that 1 to 20 megawatt size range. And then finally, the third line from the bottom, renewables, request for offers, is really the main way that we acquire renewable supplies for our customers. So we go out to the market on a fairly regular basis, conduct a competitive solicitation, and acquire supplies, sign contracts, get them approved. Transmission lines in many instances do need to be built because these are quite often larger projects, in some instances in remote locations, but they're likely the ones that are going to be delivering most of the megawatt hours to our customers. I should have mentioned when I talked about the CSI, by the way, that PG&E today has 62,000 customers that do have rooftop systems, and that's growing at about 1,000 a month. So in total, we represent within our service territory about 30% of the rooftop solar systems within the country. Again, we serve 5% of the customer base and have about 30% of the rooftop systems. So I would normally follow this slide with one similar to the one that Craig showed and that Bryan showed around the grid of the future, but I decided to take a slightly different tack, not to say I disagree with what they were representing, because that is an important part of how we're going to be transitioning now, having had such a wonderful success installing smart meters on our customers' homes and businesses, which is an important foundation of the smart grid because it does allow customers to see how they're using power in a way that they really couldn't before and take appropriate actions according to their own power profile. We're extending that work again to make appropriate investments in our grid so that it will become more and more capable of accommodating two-way flow as we get more and more distributed units on our grid, and also really digitize the grid. Effectively, the grid that we have in place today is very similar to the grid, frankly, that was around in Edison's days. It hasn't evolved to kind of keep pace with the digitalization of the economy, and it's an appropriate time now to be looking at the grid in a way to make sure that it could actually, again, accommodate some of the new technologies that customers are installing and our ability to be able to sort of better sense what's going on with the grid so that we can better manage the power flows, we can better integrate intermittent resources like solar and wind, and again, maintain reliable supply to our customers. And as Diane had mentioned earlier also, one of the most important considerations around all of these changes that are occurring is we want to make sure that they're cost effective for our customers. Because like the regulatory body, we also hear quite a bit from customers that are concerned about rates and the share of their wallet that goes into paying their electric and gas bills. And while we, again, are responding to an important public policy goal in the state to continue to add more renewable supplies, and many of our customers want a power company that provides them with clean energy, there are cost consequences that we need to address to make sure that we're responding to these policy imperatives in the most cost-effective way. And I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to talk about that theme during the Q&A. So this last slide just simply shows how we see our renewable portfolio evolving between now and 2020. And what you can really take away from this graph is just that a lot of the new renewable supplies that we're going to be adding as we get to 33% is in the form of solar. I'm sure many of you have, if not experienced directly, read about the fairly significant drop in the cost for solar over the course of really the last just couple of years. And that's great news for everybody. You know, it's great news for us as a buyer of that power for our customers. It's great news for customers who want to take advantage of solar themselves. And so you're going to see, again, a much greater share of the power that we provide you in the form of solar energy over the next 8 to 10 years. So with that, I don't know if you've got any questions specifically for me before I sit down.
Well, I'd like to thank you for your smart meter rollout.
Great entertainment
That's
value.
been provided an enormous amount of column inches. I don't know how you. For
You
us.
mean in the Chronicle or for you? Or for both?
Not to some extent for us in terms of opt-out issues and the crazier Marin and Santa Cruz people who are very.
He said it, not me.
Very the concerned Marin and Santa Cruz people about the radio frequency issues. I just wanted to, I don't have a question for you at the moment, but I wanted to stress that 50,000 rooftops through CSI represents a third of the 150,000 rooftops in the United States. Is that right? And so PG&E is clearly, and California is clearly the leader in green rooftops and solar penetration.
Yes.
Okay.
That was a softball question.
So yes, it was. I owe you. So I'm gonna ask a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience for some questions. There are index cards. Feel free to provide a question. Make sure your question is in the form of a question. So I checked the Cal ISO website today, and today's demand was 29,409 megawatts from the Cal ISO website. The governor's goal for distributed generation is 12,000 megawatts. And his goal is also 33% renewable electricity portfolio, and I think the total peak generation for the ISO in California is about 53,000 megawatts, roughly. So you'd have to divide that by 3. But is the governor's goal reasonable, possible, or even desirable? And this question is coming out to all 4 of our panelists. So is that 12,000 megawatts, is that this experiment that Diane, this horrible experiment?
I didn't say horrible.
You know, if you don't
You
have
have
an
to watch
interesting,
him.
I'm a journalist. If you don't have an interesting quote, I just make it up. That's not true. That's absolutely not true.
This
not
is
true.
being recorded.
Absolutely, it's being recorded. So is 12,000 megawatts of distributed generation, is that just, political handiwork, or that number coming as an arbitrary, or is it realistic? I mean, he didn't come out with he didn't use a Ouija board for that number, or did he use a Ouija board for that number? Is that number, do you just internally at PG&E, do you just sort of smile to yourselves and there'll be a new governor soon, right?
You know, I've spent some time being an expert witness in a regulatory forum, and I've always been counseled that when I get a question like that, I have to say, I'm sorry, can you break that down into small pieces so I know what I'm answering? Never answer a compound question.
Okay.
So I think I got the gist of your question.
But you didn't answer.
I know. Whatever the governor was thinking, you'd have to ask him and his staff. Whether
you may be
I'll
seated.
help you out.
I reserve the right to recall the witness at a later time. Does anybody on our panel have an answer for that question? You're dismissed.
Wow, that was easier than I thought.
Thank you, Diane.
Do we use these? I guess so. Yes, it is achievable. We have a fabulous array of renewable resources in California.
Okay on sound? Are we okay on sound? Yes?
Okay, it's definitely achievable. I think one of the aspects that's going to have to be addressed is we finally passed in California last year our law that moved us from 20% renewables by 2010 to 33% by 2020. For the distributed generation goal of Governor Brown, which, believe me, I support, it's not a law. It's not even an executive order. And both as a former commissioner and as a lawyer and somebody who's been in this for 35 years, in order to get to that goal, we're going to have to turn it into a law, and we're going to have to harmonize it with what is going to be the criteria that somebody's going to use to prioritize between the large-scale utility generation, the smaller size, the customer size, et cetera. Because right now, none of that has been resolved. And it's okay as we're starting to get into the first few thousand megawatts, but that's where we're going to have a law, and it's going to have to be clear what are the criteria for choosing.
But that comes back to what you said about a non-integrated regulatory policy in California. Yes, you did.
Eric, what were your three possible, what were the other two that you asked about?
I can do a
Desirable, and then there was one other one.
Possible, I don't remember the third. That's
Reasonable,
my Rick
possible, and
Perry
desirable.
imitation. Reasonable, Perry, or even desirable.
So, hopefully this thing is on. Is it possible? Yeah, absolutely. Anything's technologically possible. So swat that one aside. Is it reasonable? That's a question of what else is it competing against. And I would argue that one of the biggest challenges to distributed generation right now is the low cost of natural gas. And so if you're looking at one of these, what's the alternative and what's the environmental cost versus the cost to the customer, it depends on what natural gas is going to be and frankly what other opportunities you have for either generation or demand response. So reasonable, possible, and then desirable. I don't think that ultimately it's going to be an either-or proposition. I think that you're going to end up building out all of the different infrastructures, both on the smarter grid, on the demand side. I think you're going to end up with a full portfolio of technologies that's going to vary by parts of the state. I'd argue that probably some of the solutions in Northern California are very different from what you see in far Southern California, where you've got really good solar insulation. The folks up in Humboldt County might be thinking about something different. And so we have to take into account those differences as well. But ultimately, whether we get there or not, I think is going to depend on the economics, it's going to depend on the technology, and it's going to depend, as Diane pointed out, on the policy.
It's not likely that the price of natural gas will stay as low as it is 10 years from now. Well,
I think that's true.
It's hard to predict the future. Craig.
Yeah, so I'll just add in a few comments here. The getting to 12 gigawatts of distributed generation is not a problem for California. No matter how you cut it, cost, technology, it is the only place it's a problem is on policy. And I think that Diane, has come back around to this theme a couple of times, in that we've got to prioritize distributed generation in order to hit that goal. And I think that the governor, got to that number in a very straightforward fashion. His team sat down when they were, putting their campaign platform together when he was running for governor, and they said, how many gigawatts do we need to hit 33% by 2020? And they determined that they need 20 gigawatts. And they said, we want more than half of that to come from distributed generation. And that's how they came up with 12 of the 20 gigawatts coming from DG and 8 of the 20 coming from Central Station. It's his goal basically is comprised of those two components, even though we're only talking about the 12 gigawatts of distributed generation today. So he came up with that number in a very rational way. He prioritized the DG over Central Station and said we need to kind of buck the trend, because historically, And I think a couple people have said this, historically, it's a one-way flow from Central Station down. That's how the business has been done for the last 100 years. That's how the momentum is in that same direction. So we've got to get new policy, whether that's through the regulatory channels or whether that's through legislative edict that then forces the regulatory channels to make those changes. It doesn't really matter. It's policy innovation. We definitely need policy innovation to get to that 12 gigawatts and then take it way up from there. Getting to 12 gigawatts is not a big deal for California.
All right. So Craig, you talked about downhill flow and the way the grid has been constructed. David, you took a pass on that question, so we're going to skip over you, okay?
Wait, which question, downhill flow or?
No, so we're going to the traditional way the grid has functioned is in large generators to consumers, and now we have this conversation going on between consumers and the grid itself, but the hardware of the grid has not yet changed to accommodate that. So it's more a technology question, but can the grid withstand that? And I don't think it, in its current form, it can. It's with solar panels putting out different types of power, with reactive power mixed into the mix, variable power. What changes does David, you work at the distributed generation level. What changes hardware-wise, software-wise? Transformers are going to be stressed in a different fashion, right? And you're going to have to monitor these transformers in a different way. What do you look at from a hardware standpoint? What innovations are out there to allow this chef of the grid of the future to actually be realized?
I know this sounds like I'm taking a pass at yet a second question. I'm probably going to let Bryan answer it because I'm not an electrical engineer, but I do know that just in general terms that a lot of it really depends on where the DG goes on our grid, right? I mean, Craig had correctly pointed out earlier in his comments the fact that if you put a system, say, close to a substation, right, maybe on the low end side of the substation, you're probably going to be in a better position to have the power be absorbed without too much additional investment. And it really, again, depends obviously on the size of the substation and the transformers and the other equipment relative to the output of the DG unit. But you're probably going to be in a lower cost situation under that scenario than you might be if you're looking at putting the unit somewhere out on a radial feeder that might then need 5 miles of reconductoring in order to get the power back to where it's going to be consumed. So a large part of the answer to the question is it does depend in terms of the costs, but certainly there will be costs and there will be accommodations that will need to be made in order to absorb that much, again, generation on a system that by and large was built for power to go in one direction and not move.
Hold that thought about increased costs of just the hardware because of putting DG on the grid. Bryan, in terms of hardware?
Yeah, I think it's hardware and it's software, and frankly, it's human resources as well. Because if you look at today's power system, it wasn't built for variability. It was built to run pretty much in a consistent, constant way. And with most of the forms of distributed generation, particularly the renewable forms, you're bringing on a lot of variability to a system that really likes to stay static and stable, and that's what we want for power quality purposes. So my thinking is, you can bring on a lot more distributed generation if, yes, you get it positioned right, but you're also bringing on a lot of other resources that, number one, tell you the state of the grid, and that's something that we still don't do very well. We're deploying phasor measurement units and smart transformers and inverters and so on. And when we do that, we find that the grid is actually behaving with this distributed generation in ways that we didn't think were possible, that we didn't anticipate, but they're really kind of somewhat simple to fix. You develop different technologies, you put on energy storage, you get some sort of shock absorber capacity somewhere on the system, and the problems are resolved at the limited scale. My question remains, if we go higher up now and we're bringing in 12,000 megawatts of distributed generation, if we haven't got the shock absorber, the buffering capacity on the rest of the grid, and we don't have the situational awareness in the Cal ISO to see the cold front coming or to see the clouds moving in, then we're going to have some reliability challenges. So I think it's It's getting the operators trained to work in a variable environment, giving them the tools to see the grid, and then providing the other balancing resources that are going to be needed, regardless of whether it's utility scale or distributed.
So Diane, dust off your PUC hat for a second. And so one of the jobs of the PUC is to protect the ratepayer from massive increases in price. Is that possibly one of the charters of the PUC?
I think it is.
Okay. And here you have this effort to go after DG, but it's going to require a build out of hardware of a lot of billions of dollars, and the potential. So how does that play in the utility commission?
One very good law in my mind is that it was passed, I think, about 3 years ago by Senator Padilla, and it requires the utilities to develop what's called a smart grid plan, looking out over 10 years. And then it requires the Public Utilities Commission to take lots of public input. I'm sure you guys have intervened and put yours in, and I'm sure, well, EPRI probably has, and pg&e has, et cetera. Collect all that input and then make whatever modifications, and that we'd actually have a plan for the smart grid build out in California. I'm a big fan of sort of looking ahead and saying, where do we want to be in 2020? And what this law is requiring is that you actually then need to look at what is going to be the investment and get some idea. It's not actually approving the investment. That's done through these very complex proceedings, but it's going to give us a sense of how much is this actually going to cost. And then out of that, there's going to be some priorities of how the money's spent.
So those smart grid plans they're already written and they're available.
You can go on.
They can be found online, right?
The ones submitted by the utilities have been submitted. Under the state law, the Public Utilities Commission, as I said, is taking comment, and then out of that it will make modifications, give direction, et cetera.
They're very detailed 200-page reports from Southern California, Edison, and PG&E, and
right, and they'll be, when the commission adopts the decision, typically they'll have some short synopsis, but as I said, it most importantly gives some priorities, I think. And I'll just say one other item, though you didn't ask me. I'm a huge fan of all this distribution automation and bringing IT into this system. And I think we are going to solve the technical issues of keeping all this stuff running okay with increased levels of DG. I think it can be solved. It's sort of a question of, it's still an experiment of what's happening when the chicken and egg, but I think the technology can be developed.
And just to pile on that, you've already got a bunch of utilities, both public and private, around the country engaged in smart grid demonstration projects in various communities with DG, without DG, with renewables, without, all sorts of different mixes. And that's how we're going to learn about how these systems interact and develop the response tools that Diane mentioned.
Craig, did you have a comment?
Yes. So in order to make all this happen, you actually have to follow the money. And there's a lot of money involved here for building out this DG future. But there's also a lot of money involved in maintaining the status quo. And so there's two really big buckets of money that we have to look at as Californians, as ratepayers in California. Because right now, if you just follow status quo, you're spending 3/4 of all your capital expenditures that are being spent for you by the utilities are being spent on the distribution grid. That's that's billions of dollars every year here in California. So there's a pool of money to make sure that those investments are being made in a very intelligent fashion that is moving our distribution grids to where they need to be to accommodate high penetrations of clean local energy and the pertinent intelligent grid solutions that are needed. In addition to that, if you look at the status quo line, the next 20 years, if you project the plans in California for investment in the transmission infrastructure, we're looking at $80 billion. That's a lot of money. So if we can save half of that, I agree with Bryan that it's going to be a portfolio solution. But guess what? If we don't start thinking about how that future is really going to look and start making sure that the money is spent in the most intelligent fashion for our long-term future, we're going to end up spending $80 billion of ratepayer money on stranded assets, because I don't think we're going to need all that transmission, because the DG plus IG future is going to happen, and we're going to end up with stranded assets out there. So there's two big pools of money, $80 billion that's being earmarked for transmission over the next 20 years. A lot of that can be moved to DG plus IG, and lots of money is already being spent on the distribution grid, billions of dollars a year, and we need to make sure that that investment is being made in an intelligent fashion for all of us ratepayers.
Okay. So we're going to go to questions from the audience, and I have three of a kind in this particular hand. So, for example, what kind of storage is available in the next 3 to 5 years? Describe the properties of the dream technology for distributed energy storage. What existing technology is most attractive? And several speakers mentioned energy storage. What energy storage technology will we use over the next decade? So that's probably another there's enough information for another panel there. So, does anybody want to make a very succinct, brief reply to the state of energy storage and where it will be in 3 to 5 years? David?
You said brief?
Yeah.
I mean, I'll just make a general comment, which is we do see storage as being integral to the equation. And we have seen drops in prices in some types of storage. I, at this point, don't have a one-size-fits-all answer in terms of whether the storage is, again, going to be distributed and located closer to load, or in some instances it'll be more centralized, like pump storage, hydro, or compressed air. I think there's room for all different types of storage, and I think a lot of it is really going to be necessary to accommodate, again, the intermittency of a lot of the renewable resources that we will be bringing on.
Bryan, EPRI has a whole group
Yeah.
dedicated to storage.
Yeah, we've got about a $5 million per year research program just on energy storage. They published a white paper last year, an electric energy storage white paper, which I encourage you to go EPRI.com and download, and we'll be happy to make it available. But that paper, I think, stated the case pretty clearly. Storage is not a one-size-fits-all. You're going to need a very different storage solution to balance what's going on at the residential level with PV versus what's going on at the large wind integrated side, where you've got pumped hydro, compressed air, some of these other things. I think we need both in advancements in the battery chemistries and the battery technologies, which will be an integral part of what goes on behind the substation. But we've really got to engineer, I think, the thing that worries me the most is the large scale, when you've built out to 12,000 megawatts and then 12,000 megawatts of utility scale solar and something else. What happens if you have multiple failures and you're not producing because of the inherent variability? That's the thing that scares me. And when you look at, well, we've got a lot of potential hydro resources in the Sierra, one only needs to reflect on the snow that was not available for me to ski on last weekend to know that even that is a variable resource in and of itself. So I think the gigawatt day problem is a huge one.
Succinct.
Okay. I serve on the U.S. Department of Energy's Electricity Advisory Committee, and one of the subcommittees I'm on is the Energy Storage Committee. And one good thing from the Federal Stimulus Act was that there's a lot of money going into storage. So my first point is we actually need to advance the technology. But this is an area in particular where policy hasn't caught up because we don't yet have a value stream for paying for storage, because the only type of storage that's been built around the world are huge pump storage projects, the Helms pump storage projects, utility owned. They just go to the utility commission, get approval, goes in the rate base, and it's paid for. What we're talking about in this new world is lots of different people having storage probably. And so who's going to pay for that? Is it the utilities? Is it the operator of the grid here in California, the CAISO? And what's going to be the criteria for choosing what you're paid? That's a huge area that we're just starting to figure out. What are the questions, much less what are the answers. But payment for the storage is going to be incredibly important.
I would suggest that if you did have this dream technology that you asked about and it costs 0 cents per kilowatt hour, you still wouldn't be able to get it on the grid because there's not a regulatory framework in which to make it work.
Yeah, that's like item number 2 on my list of how to have fun with a regulator, is ask them whether or not energy storage is a generation supply side resource,
Transmission,
or whether
load,
it's
or
transmission,
absolutely.
or whether it's a load. That's always a good one.
We have a
Yeah.
there's a startup in the audience, TerraJoule, and they're doing some interesting work with energy storage, and they may still be. Are you in the audience? Are you still in the audience? There they are. There's your plug, and my karmic balance has been achieved. So if you want to talk to them, they'd love to talk to you. Especially the utility would probably maybe maybe not. That may not be the market they're going after. When do customers get time of day pricing so they can manage their energy use? This is also a topic for another panel as well. Although the event we were at last week, there was a FERC chairman who gave a presentation about a day in the life of the grid on the hottest day in MISO, the Midwest Independent Systems Operator. And it certainly seems that FERC gets the idea that there needs to be some type of pricing signals being sent to customers more so than it's currently being going. So, Diane.
But FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, it regulates on what's called the wholesale. So it doesn't actually set rates at the retail level. And all of you who in your homes or your businesses, that's what is called the retail. So, and I know John very well, and he's a fabulous advocate of all this, but his agency doesn't actually set any of the rates in this area. So it's really a matter of, quite frankly, a lot of politics of switching out from the types of rate structures we have now. I'm not going to go into dynamic pricing, but frankly, there are winners and losers when you start to really have real-time pricing and feedback of you turn that refrigerator on and you're going to pay 10 times more than you thought you were going to. I think there's some schedule for when this is all happening, but it's still very, very political because, as I said, there's winners and losers.
Okay. I think a lot of our answers can be answered exactly with that.
Ditto, we'll just say.
Our questions can be answered with that answer.
Let me just add one quick point.
Is there a time frame that you're doing it?
Well, we are in the process of rolling out dynamic pricing. The schedule has changed a bit. I mean, as a practical matter, all of you today could go on to a time of use rate if you like. It won't be hour by hour. In other words, you'll be paying different rates depending on whether you're on a weekday during the summer or nighttime during the winter. Those types of rates exist for businesses. They've existed for quite some time. And for large businesses, you're required to go onto a rate schedule with those types of what are called bins, again, blocks of prices during certain time frames. It'll be a little while, and don't hold me to this, but I think it's within the next couple of years that we'll start introducing, for residential, it's put off a bit later than that, but for business customers, we are going to start introducing, again, rate schedules that will allow you to see differential pricing hour by hour. So it'll be coming, but it's phasing in depending on the type of customer class that you're in.
But it is worth noting, because so many people relate energy to telecom, that you don't have hourly pricing in the telecom market. In other words, your cell phone still has peak and on-peak, and sort of this binned approach. And part of me wonders just how the consumers will respond to an hourly price when maybe they don't have the wherewithal to do so other than through demand response. They may not have the automated energy management system in their homes that takes full advantage of that.
If you can charge your EV at 2 in the morning at a 40 cents gasoline per gallon equivalent versus charging it at 5 p.m. at a $3. I'm making these numbers
but
up.
if you hear what David was saying, in theory, we have that rate structure already today, and there's no magic about doing that. And from a binning standpoint, the real question is, will we have to go to the hourly or the sub-hourly because we're bringing on so many of these distributed resources that we want more active control of the demand side to help balance them out? I think that's still an unknown.
Thank you for your thoughtful questions, by the way, audience.
Let me just add on a thought there. So this isn't as easy as it sounds to get done, but what the Clean Coalition is promoting and we've just really formulated this as a position, is to maintain the baseline pricing that already exists on everybody's bills in California. So if you are on a fixed income, you're a retired person, and you're really concerned about your energy rates going up, as long as you stay within your baseline, you're fine. Nothing changed for you from being in a tiered structure that we have today to going to true dynamic real-time pricing. But once you get above that baseline level, then you are in real time. And whatever the value of energy is at any instant, that's the price you're going to pay for it. So there's a way to protect yourself against that for the people who are worried about the fixed income folks. And then everybody else above that, you're going to be very motivated to spend a little money to arbitrage that energy experience that you're going to be paying for if you're above your baseline.
That's going to be a hot one in the legislature.
Absolutely. It's going to be
That's what I said,
really
it's all
hot.
political.
But we think it's the right solution, and we think it's the policy that drives the distributed generation and drives the intelligent grid solutions, and it puts the money there. And that's what we ultimately have to do. We have to put the money into these solutions. We have to find the policy that drives the money to these solutions in order for them to happen.
Okay. Diane, this is for you. They spelled your name right. PUCs and scale. If each state, for example, California or Rhode Island, optimizes for itself, how can you expect a rational, optimal energy generation system for the U.S. as a nation?
There is not, and there's not going to be a national, I was going to say national rational, but that
Yep.
sounds a little bit difficult. We are set up in a United States of America, and it's actually not going to change in terms of suddenly having a command and control done at the national level. I lived through for the last, I don't know, umpteen years, the whole idea that we were going to be building, and you'll remember this, the superhighway of transmission. That sort of died down, but the idea was that somebody would sit down with a map and just draw out, just like we built a highway system. Literally, it was done on a map, a piece of paper, and we would just have these massive amounts. That is where the 80 billion is, incidentally, is the Western interconnection. It would just be drawn up, and then somebody in Washington, D.C. would be given authority to collect the money to build out this highway. Somebody would be given authority to mandate the renewable power that would all be built and to solve the issues of is it large scale or distributed generation. Does anybody think we live in a political system today that's going to give anybody in D.C. that type of authority? I also personally don't think that that's the way to go, that you don't necessarily get good decisions if it is all centralized. So we live in a world which under 150 years of regulation, utility regulation, it's state utility commissions with utilities, with all sorts of other people who are making and driving where we're going with energy. We have 33 states, is that right? My number on who have renewable portfolio standards. So I'm a believer that the states haven't done that bad a job of prioritizing. We want renewables, prioritizing, we want efficiency. But I think the chance that it's all going to switch over to the federal government is 0%.
Okay, so it's 50 markets, not one market, right?
There's tremendous communication and actually a lot of integration. I shouldn't say integration. There is a lot of work behind the scenes and overtly with the renewable standards. They're not 50 literally different, 30 different renewable standards. There's a lot of overlap. There are inconsistencies in some areas, but it's not literally just complete chaos, even though it probably seems sometime.
Eric, I think it's worth just noting that when you get onto the wholesale side, which wholesale distributed generation obviously is on the wholesale side, the federal rules apply. And so the federal game is actually really, really pertinent to wholesale distributed generation, and that involves the two big barriers that I mentioned in my presentation: procurement and interconnection. So FERC basically controls the keys. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission controls the keys on both of those issues, because procurement is going to depend largely on avoided cost valuations, and FERC has provided the states with lots of latitude now, but that's a recent change. The second thing on interconnection, FERC develops the interconnection standards that are used by pretty much all of the utilities across the country for their interconnection procedures. So the two big barriers that I talked about are really relevant at the federal level. So if we can get those two enabling policies set by FERC, it makes it a lot easier for the states to put really good policies in place.
Okay, we have a wealth of questions, and we have only about 3 or 4 minutes, so if we don't get to your question, I apologize. And again, some of the questions you're asking are panel evening level things, but if wind and solar generation require fossil-fueled complementary generation, parentheses, forever, and if the complementary sources must supply the majority of the electricity in any fossil/wind or fossil/solar combination, or wind or solar electricity sustainable? I think that we're going to have to leave that as a rhetorical question. But Bryan, this kind of brings up the shock absorber thing you spoke about, right?
It does, and if you're going to try to run a system that also meets the state's ambition to reduce carbon 80% from 1990 levels under 2050, then whatever you're balancing with has to itself be zero emission.
Can't have a coal plant balancing this,
and
yes.
when you start to look at what the state's energy system might look like in 2050, and you think about the amount of renewables that will be required to satisfy the need for kilowatt hours, and then you figure out, well, how much are we going to balance? That really brings home this question of gigawatt day energy storage, demand response capability that is sub-hourly in nature. It's a fundamentally different electricity system when you start thinking about 2050, and that was the focus of the work that we did in our California Energy Futures study, which, if you haven't read that, grab it, ccst.us, and have a look at it.
All right, so we're in the lightning round. We have to keep going here. A year ago, there was a panel discussion on solar electricity at utility scale. It was mentioned that 65 gigawatts were in various planning stages in Southern California. Is this really true? What does it mean? I'll answer that question. I think, I would imagine there might have been 65 gigawatts in various planning stages, and that is a very, very wide net. So there's a big difference between a developer floating an idea and a developer getting a interconnect and a power purchase agreement. So there's definitely tens of gigawatts in planning stages. There's probably single digits gigawatts that's in realistic deployment numbers. David, is that a reasonable thing to say?
For solar, I think we've got roughly about 5 gigawatts under contract that are at various stages of developing.
Over the
So
next
that's for
couple of
PG&E?
years, right?
Correct.
Okay. And that includes Bright Source coming on in 2014 and 2016.
Yeah, exactly.
Turtles be willing.
I'll just say, if anybody wants to know literally the data and the numbers on what there is on renewables, under state law, the Public Utilities Commission puts out a quarterly report on the status of renewables. You just go online, and it gives great detail with all the technologies and what's happening.
Sure. Or you can go to Green Tech Media, and we have those resources as well.
Take it from the CPUC.
I hope so, if it's free.
So, Craig, with Germany's growth in PV and phasing out all nuclear power, and I'll interject, all the nuclear power in Germany, they're not above importing nuclear power from France. How do they plan on meeting loads when no sun? Well, I think I answered that question. They'll import it from France. Sorry, Craig.
It's the Eric hour.
I'm sorry. Bryan, once again, they're asking about storage options. So you need to have a panel on storage. Again, this is grounds for another panel. Knowing what we know about managing two-way electron flows, i.e. the internet, we know the most efficient operating method would be to operate the electric grid as a platform. And that's kind of what we've spoken a bit about tonight, and allow customer-facing energy services companies to innovate on the grid. Is this feasible, especially from a policy standpoint? Realize that the internet can go out a little bit, right? And the electrical grid, that's a no-no, right? So
You should be in my house when the internet goes out. I will say, though, that's why I think we at EPRI are putting a big focus on interoperability.
I was gonna say
whether
that
it's devices in the home that are communicating via smart grid, different types of automobiles that are charging infrastructure. I think that's, if you don't have that, then a lot of the promise that we're talking about won't work. Speaking of my family.
Okay, I think we're going to stop. I think we're going to stop there. It's late, and so.